Hi, welcome back to another video feature of the Immersive Worlds Handbook. Today I am in Los Angeles, California at the Grove, and I wanted to take you around this shopping mall and talk a little bit about the influence of theme parks on shopping malls like this one in Los Angeles. And I think any journey into the world of the theme park involves looking at Main Street. And I have Main Street in quotations here because, of course, there's a difference, I think, in terms of what we see with this version of Main Street at the Grove and what we might expect to see in a park like Disneyland. Albeit, this isn't the same type of Main Street that we might see in a theme park, but it certainly has that feel, that appeal of walking down a pedestrian thoroughfare, particularly here with no traffic. There's the trolley line right there that you can see, and we'll get to that a bit later. And there is on both the left and right of the pedestrian, the guest, various stores ranging from the Apple Store to all sorts of restaurants and so forth. And I should say that the Grove is a relatively small space, and that did surprise me. On the left there, you'll see that cafe restaurant reminds me of some of the spaces you'd see on the Las Vegas Strip, particularly the one restaurant that has been for many years outside of the Paris in Las Vegas. And you can also see the fountain here, and we'll get to this in a bit. Certainly having a key feature like a fountain is a big part of creating a space maybe that you could say is similar to a theme park. And I developed this feature after taking part in a cultural studies conference on theme parks in Los Angeles, and Larry Touch, who was a consultant on the Immersive World Handbook, had talked about the Grove as a space that has theme park influences. And the next thing I want to talk about is this idea of a key feature. And I feature the fountain here because it is, I think, the predominant feature that you see when you visit the Grove. It's a central feature. It's a great place for people to gather and mingle around. It's just next to another pedestrian area that I'll show you in a bit that is actually a location where the TV show Extra is filmed. And it's something that the eyes are certainly drawn to. You also see the statue there. That's just prior to seeing the prior to the fountain in the center. We're back to the fountain here. So the statue and the fountain both are these features that you could say are similar to what Disney talked about as the weenie in a theme park, something that draws your eye to it. The fountain, I would say, is not as dramatic as maybe other fountains you might see, particularly in Las Vegas. The Bellagio and this fountain do share something in common, and the same company, WT, created both fountains. I think what you see in this version, though, is it's a much smaller attempt to create a sense of performativity via music and the movement of the fountain. And you can see some of that video playing here of the particular fountain. And I think what's key in both theme parks and a mall like this is this idea that you have ambient space, that you have material features and architectural features and landscape features that are interesting to the guest. I think in a traditional mall, if you just have stores, that focuses only on the functionality of the retail side of things. Theme parks, of course, are much broader than this and involve retail and many other features. And certainly all theme parks, and I would say the Grove, have a focus on public space. And in this case, you can see there's a band playing on the day of my visit. And in fact, the public space that I experienced at the Grove on the weekend was very, very crowded, very dense. But throughout the space, they had features like these, costumes from different shows that you'll see. One of the shows, Outlander, was featured actually. This is where I think back inside in the concierge area. And part of public space involves, in the theme park world and the mall world, management. And in terms of managing public space, you could think about having enough features spread out such that you're taking emphasis or taking stress off one area of the mall or the theme park, better dispersing the crowd. And going back to Coney Island amusement parks, of course, one of the issues there was always about how do you manage space. This is the concierge area, the valet area that is just in the rear of the Grove, and you could see obviously that this is another side of public space management that goes on at the Grove. And this is just giving you another shot of the main thoroughfare at this innovative mall in Southern California. And another reflection here at the Grove that I was reading about is the architects, when they designed the space, were interested in reproducing some of the classic era architecture of Los Angeles. And you can also see that some of the Disney techniques are noted when we look at some of these examples of the false fronts of the many stores here at the Grove. And as I just mentioned in that video that I recorded on site at the Grove, you know, the architecture of many contemporary shopping malls and mixed retail areas or venues throughout the country, throughout the world really, have taken advantage of some dramatic uses of architecture. And I mentioned Larry Touch and his observations about this mall, and he was particularly taken with the fact that there was a focus on architecture at the Grove that did replicate some of the approaches, some of the concerns that you might see in theme park architecture. And maybe not unlike a Universal City Walk, albeit in a much more muted sense here, you see an eclectic use of architecture, approach to architecture. And I'm not an architect, so I won't try to talk about the various architectural styles. I'll leave that to the architects. But I would say that there's a very diverse approach to architecture here. Again, this is a relatively small space. There's one thoroughfare you'll see just there, I think next to the mic, if that's a Michael Kors, that ends rather abruptly. But what they've done with some of the architecture is to create a different approach to space. Maybe not that same sense of forced perspective that you get in Disney's Main Street, but an approach to box stores or traditional stores such that you give a different appearance in terms of depth being provided to the storefronts. And so this is, I think, one way to create personality in a mall, in a space that maybe is in some ways like a theme park. And right here, this actually is the demarcation point between the very famous LA Farmers Market, just at that traffic crossing guard area, and then looking past the stop sign straight ahead, that's where we were, that's the Grove. We're back here at that small thoroughfare that I mentioned, and I saw quite a few people taking photos. You can see the folks there taking photos near the clock there. So this was a place, I think, for tourists that I noted they really appreciated the space. And certainly the architecture that you see is in some ways innovative and much different than maybe traditional malls where there's less attention to what could be considered less significant, in this case, the second story spaces. Now, there's also, I think, an emphasis here on what I might call performativity. And what we're looking at here is, at the time, this was the trolley wasn't operating, but this is basically the trolley garage. And one of the other things that was discussed at this conference I was at, the Cultural Studies Conference in Los Angeles some time ago, was this idea that the trolley, of course, has an association with theme parks, and specifically Disney theme parks. And so I think this is one way that you could say this particular mall, the Grove, is very much like a theme park. And I'm showing you some video that I shot. Again, the trolley wasn't working, but I have a second video in which it is. Performativity means that there's movement, there's something happening. Think the Las Vegas Strip and all the spectacle that you see there. In this case, you see the trolley. It connotes something maybe about Main Street, something about a simpler time. Impractical in the sense that it's a very short walk from the extreme end of the Grove to the extreme end of the LA Farmers Market. But again, this serves a performative function in giving the guests something to look at and something to get excited about. So in this sense, I think the Grove is very much like a theme park. Now, in this next sense, I would suggest this begins to fall down, or it doesn't really work in this sense if we're comparing theme parks and malls. What we would typically see is some form of narrative development of some form of storytelling, a depth to a space, a history. Think a Disney theme park and, all the rich sorts of narratives that you get when you go on a ride like Pirates of the Caribbean. This is one example I saw at a store where they were trying to, Banana Republic, trying to get people to think about the consumption of water and specifically the ills associated with plastic water bottles. This is a story. This is something that takes you outside of the pure consumption of the retail moment. Aside from this, I didn't see a lot of it. I saw some signage. There was near the statue I showed you some indication there of a narrative, a story behind it, perhaps from the artist. I didn't get to research it, but very much limited. So I think to some extent, if we start talking about the comparison of theme parks and malls, this is one area maybe where we don't see as much of that theme park influence, and that is in the arena of storytelling and narrative. If it were a theme park or closer to a theme park, I believe we would see much more development of things like story and narrative that we see at famous theme parks like those of Disney. Hope you enjoyed this feature here at the Grove in Los Angeles, California, and please come back for additional video features of the Immersive Worlds Handbook.